This is Race and Ethnicity, Chapter 8, Part 4. And I will kind of warn you guys ahead of time that with all of the things that are happening right now, I'm pretty upset. So if I get very emotional in this part of the lecture, hopefully you'll understand why. On slide 13, though, I start with institutional discrimination. Now, I mentioned in the last part of the lecture that a lot of people have problems differentiating between the two. Institutional discrimination then actually speaks to all of the systems in our society and kind of the legacy that slavery has left in terms of how different races are treated. So you guys know by now, the criminal justice system then has been under fire pretty much since existence, but I actually say multiple decades simply because up until probably the 80s or 90s, there was not the same awareness and protest of the criminal justice disproportionate arrests and imprisonments of Black people. What we find is that very much disproportionate imprisonment and arrests. But what we also find is that when white people then are accused of the same crimes, they don't face the same repercussions that Black people do. So what they've shown is that whites are actually more likely than Black people to smoke weed. Surprise. Probably not to most of you because you know. But Black people then are 4 times more likely to be arrested for possession. And of all of the people in prison right now on weed offenses, 80% it was just possession. It was not selling, it was not, having crazy amounts. It really was just possession. Now, when it comes, and I'm going to circle back to chapter 7 where I talked about redlining, right? And the effects that it had. So the second point on this talks about the Federal Housing Authority, the FHA, and how it basically systematically and explicitly kind of created these policies that excluded Black Americans while benefiting whites. You already learned about redlining and the effect that it had on racial segregation and social stratification. And what happened with that, it is very difficult to undo, because if you basically displace people and force them to live in concentrated poverty, there is very little chance then of moving out of that, because you already know poverty is cyclical. And what I will argue is that this is not restricted then to Black Americans, that we can see the same thing going on with American Indians on the reservations, with Latinx people in the barrio. And what most people don't know is that the first group then to be completely banned from coming to the United States, and who actually then were forcibly then also left. And in this case, it was actually legislation that said you need to live in these areas, were the Chinese. That after we came and built the railroads, they really did not want Chinese Americans in the U.S. So after that point, they just banned Chinese Americans from immigrating, and like I said, it was not until 1965 that we were allowed to immigrate. Okay. So what happens with institutional discrimination, it directly has an impact on the individual. As you can imagine, that if you say, well, this is going to affect the legal repercussions that you have, this is going to affect your housing situations, where you can live. What I've already explained to you guys is that residential segregation actually continues the racial segregation of our educational systems. I tell students that shortly after I moved to Rochester, I had one of my students actually contact me and say, Professor, you're an expert on race relations. Will you please come with me to help my friend? And what happened was that Fisher, even though this friend actually had a 4.0 from one of the better RCSD schools at the time, Fisher, oops, I just said the name. A college around here would not accept his GPA because they basically said that the school was subpar and that it didn't count as much. And I went in there and argued. He didn't control where he lived, right? You can't just say, well, I think I'll just move to the suburbs and pull, the deposit for a house kind of out of nowhere. He couldn't actually control that. And by saying, well, because you are zoned to the school, none of the work that you did counts, you basically are kind of reproducing a cycle where you are not going to see as many Black people then entering higher education. So you can see how institutional discrimination then impacts the individual. I'm going to go into this a little bit more when I talk about individual discrimination, which is slide 14. So what happens with individual discrimination is, well, we actually kind of run to this idea of hate crimes, right? And these are, once again, the verbal and physical assaults that are targeted at people who belong to a certain category. And these verbal and physical assaults in the United States have kind of reached a heightened frequency that is very difficult to ignore. That has been a lot of attention then placed on members of the criminal justice system or police officers, killing unarmed Black men and women. You guys have seen about the Ahmaud Arbery case, where you were looking at civilians then who actually murdered a Black man who was out jogging. He was out exercising. In fact, you have all of the governors saying, make sure you go outside and exercise. He was doing that and then murdered. Just last week, I don't know if you guys have seen this case, a teenager, Black male teenager, 18 years old, graduating senior, good student from a predominantly white neighborhood, was at home playing video games when 15 armed white men actually stormed his house because they thought they had mistaken him for another person who had run away with one of the guy's daughters. And can you imagine how terrifying that is? You're just in your home playing video games, and suddenly a mob then comes in there with guns, screaming at you, demanding to know where their daughter is. I can only imagine the trauma involved. So what happens in this case with these verbal and physical assaults, you are looking at them coming out of nowhere to people who are just going about their everyday lives. I really haven't left my apartment since March 13th, because of all of the assaults and hate crimes that are being committed against Asian Americans right now. And what's happened is there is a reporting system, and what they're showing is that there is kind of an exponential rise in hate crimes towards Asian Americans because of the COVID virus. That I actually did venture out to the store 2 days ago, and was actually very scared the entire time I was there. Came home, the first thing that popped up in my news articles when I checked was that an Asian American woman had actually been randomly harassed and kicked in the face a couple of days ago. So what happens is, because it comes out of the blue, you see that BIPOC are kind of in, all of us are on edge right now because we really can't anticipate all this stuff happening. Because if it happens to all of these people that we read about, what's going to prevent it happening to us? That in March, and you guys probably heard of this case too, a family, Asian American family, and I think they were Southeast Asian, so not even remotely related to China whatsoever, probably detest China because of, all of the history. They were actually all stabbed by a man at a Sam's Club who basically said that he was killing the virus. He slashed a 2-year-old baby across the face because of this. it makes everyday life then kind of tense and on edge, that you can't really feel safe if that is the case. And I can't stop thinking about this teenager who literally was at home playing video games when charged by a mob of white people. So why do I bring all of this up? Why these cases have been extremely publicized is that you are looking at random attacks. In the case of Ahmaud Arbery, actual murder, and no arrests immediately. No arrests immediately. They're out there kind of walking around for weeks and days with no punishment whatsoever. I think with Arbery's case, I don't know that if they hadn't had the amount of pressure that they had from the general public, if they would have actually arrested these men. And it's only one step in this whole chain. So when it comes to individual discrimination, what you can see is that it works in conjunction. That is, if you feel kind of like you can go up and harass another person with impunity, without anything happening to you, you are going to more likely go up and actually harass someone or direct hate towards them. So that is the extreme case. When it comes to individual discrimination, though, you can also see discrimination of people then under direct supervision. That is, when I first came to the Rochester area, I actually became friends with a lot of the Black, Indigenous, people of color women in the area who have PhDs and worked in academia. And at the time, there were a lot of discrimination lawsuits that were taking place. And it was interesting to see that a lot of the reasons that these women did not get promoted or get tenure were for these kind of hazy arguments, like collegiality. One was told that she was not friendly enough, that she was a little too aggressive, etc. This actually comes then, it is individual discrimination because you are looking at it coming from the people who recommend and promote. But it's also institutional in that it happens in an institution. What happened in all of their cases, every single one of them won their lawsuit, and I'm actually happy because they're at colleges like Harvard and Duke and Northwestern now, instead of the area colleges who probably did not actually deserve them in the first place. So I come to the idea of microaggressions. Now, even though the word micro makes people think, well, they're just tiny, micro actually means you're doing it on an individual level. And I give you guys the definition, which is everyday uses of subtle verbal and nonverbal communications that convey denigrating or dismissive messages to members of certain social groups. And to a lot of people of a dominant majority, they don't understand this one at all. A lot of times, and throughout my childhood, I was told, well, just ignore it. It doesn't matter. The person didn't mean harm, etc., etc. But what happens is they're cumulative. So it's pretty much, and I always say, it's like you touch a place repeatedly over and over and over again, eventually it's going to hurt. You're going to bruise yourself. You're going to get wounded. Microaggressions work in the same way, okay? That is, one of the things that has kind of plagued me for my entire life is this insinuation that I am not American or that I don't know what's going on. I always give accounts, and so I'll tell you two of the ones that actually stick out the most. And like I said, just drops in the bucket because I could actually list then probably dozens of cases of microaggressions. But I was sitting in my office, which was a corner office. A student popped her head in and said, "Oh, could you tell me which way is to the bathroom?" And I told her, and then she goes, "Are you from China?" And I actually looked at her. I was like, "Did I give you those directions in Chinese? Like, I don't understand how it's relevant." And she's like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you," and left. Now, to a lot of people, it would have been like, well, she just asked a question. However, you're going to really think of what that question means, which is, I am identifying you as not belonging, right? That something about you is not normal. Therefore, I need to question your existence here and why you are sitting in an office on a college campus, rather than going, oh, well, she's a professor in America. She's probably American. The other one then is this idea that people kind of assume I don't know what's going on or what I want. I was actually standing and buying shampoo and conditioner. I was standing in the hair care aisle, and the conditioner and shampoo that I use actually is, a black hair care product, Cream of Nature. And I was standing there looking for it, and this older white woman comes up to me, and she goes, honey, and I was like, yes. She goes, when they say ethnic hair care, they don't mean your kind of ethnic. They mean the other kind of ethnic. And I kind of turned and looked at her and said, I know what shampoo I'm looking for. It may seem like no big deal. In fact, that one was kind of like a little bit hilarious in the case. But what it happens is that constantly you're reminded you don't belong, you don't fit in, we don't see you as being like everyone else. So what I say on this slide is that if BIPOC actually lashes out at a microaggression, it may seem unwarranted and kind of exaggerated to any individual white person who does it, right? That is, you may have been the 10th person to ask me, what are you? Or where are you from? And suddenly I freak out on you. It's because that one interaction is just one in a whole lifetime of microaggressions. Okay. So this next one is actually a very touchy subject right now. I find a lot of people get very hostile when I start talking about it, but that is the topic of white privilege. Privilege is not a bad thing. It really isn't. Privilege is any unearned advantage. So unearned, basically meaning that you didn't do anything to earn it, that is accorded to members of a dominant social group, right? So we've already talked about all of these dimensions of privilege. If you are white, if you are male, if you are wealthy, if you are straight, if you are able-bodied and don't have a disability, then you have privilege. I have privilege because I'm straight. I have privilege because my parents very educated, on the wealthier side when you look at the continuum. What I tell people is I didn't get to control who I was born as. I didn't get to control a lot of it. Privilege is an accident of birth. Just like you can't control being born to a oppressed group, you can't really control what group who you were born to, right? So it's nothing to really get defensive of. Instead, what you have to do is put it within a context and actually acknowledge and realize it. Okay. So I think a lot of people get upset at this word privilege, because white people have a rough time too. They have things going on in their lives. Not all not all men then have an easy time of it. That inevitably a lot of people do work hard and suffer hardships when it comes to this idea of privilege. But what most dominant groups do then is that they're unaware of their privilege, and they just actually believe that their experiences are the norm. Privilege doesn't exactly translate to wealth, or we don't actually assume that white people don't have any struggles when we talk about white privilege. Instead, there's an ease in navigating the world that people don't ever question, right? That is, right now, I told you I'm not leaving my apartment because I know that this actually marks me as someone who is from East Asia. It actually makes me a target. And as of now, I really don't know that any white people actually navigate everyday life kind of being terrified that they're going to be targeted for their race. Okay. So what happens is I often hear things about, and it's always spoken by a white person when talking about race relations, is if a critique is made about white people will say, well, what if a white person said that about a black person? Doing that ignores pretty much everything institutional and everything systemic in the United States. It's not equal. It's not the same. You can't actually say that the experiences are identical, and the comparisons then actually don't make sense, because you are looking at a situation where if you are white in the United States, you can go about your life with relatively less hassle than if you were Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. So what can you do? You can't give it back, right? You can't really do anything to change this idea of privilege. You can work towards it institutionally and systematically and try to make a difference that way. On the individual level, what do? There's a realization that, okay, I do have this privilege of being able to negotiate the world a little bit easier. Be conscious of it. Be conscious of it in your everyday life, and also then be an ally, be aware, kind of inform others. When people start making this argument of, well, not all white people, or, well, I worked hard too, correct them. Say, well, do you know, sociologically, this concept doesn't mean that you didn't work hard, etc. Instead, just let them know, okay, this is white privilege. It's not your fault, right? You have no control over it. The only thing you can do is acknowledge and recognize it, and really try to change society so that we aren't so unequal. Okay. So the last slide on this then actually speaks to what we are aiming for, and that is pluralism. Okay. Pluralism, multiculturalism, it's gone by different names, but all as it is basically a cultural pattern which values and promotes racial and ethnic variation in a society. Now, when I was growing up, the idea of racial harmony in the United States was very much, okay, all the rest of you who aren't white, try to be more white. And once again, bringing up personal examples, even though my dad is very fluent in English, he actually knows 8 languages at this point, and he learned 3 of them, which were just completely unrelated to the Asian language. He learned Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic after the age of 65. His English, he wrote a dissertation in it, very, very fluent in English. His company actually made him go to foreign accent retraining. Well, that's what I called it, because the acronym would be FART. But they made him go to accent retraining courses to try to get rid of his accent. So that is this idea of assimilation, where everyone then is kind of forced to adhere to the dominant norms. What sociologists argue is we actually have to look towards a model of pluralism where we recognize, acknowledge, and celebrate difference, right? Instead of seeing them, BIPOC, as outsiders and un-American, instead of, basically accusing people who look like me of being from China and being a virus, it is this idea that, well, Americans have all sorts of different shapes and sizes and appearances, and that we are all American too. What I argue is that my life has been very multicultural from the very beginning, that I can't actually remember a time where there hasn't been a huge, robust variety of people and cultures and traditions in my life. And I think that what happens is people who don't have that are actually missing out in some ways, because it really does provide a better, I would say it's more robust. Like, my life is richer and it's enhanced for knowing all of these different cultures, for being able to kind of experience and share in cultural traditions. And I think that the rest of America could benefit. Because one of the things that we can't seem to pull our minds out of in terms of American mindsets is that when you do start talking about diversity and inclusion, when you say we need to make a purposeful hopeful move to actually have more variety of people within our workplace, I actually hear words like undeserving. I actually hear words like unqualified over and over and over again. I urge you to kind of flip your lens on that one, because you need to think of it this way. If your availability pool is only one group, then you are limited to only that one group of talent. Now, you have to recognize that individuals of all races and ethnicities, then there are talented individuals within those groups. Because seriously, if you really don't believe that, then I am going to call you a racist. If you have your availability pool then enlarged and you have all of the people that you can choose from, then you are actually strengthening your country, right? Doesn't that make sense to you guys? That if you include everyone, then the top people are actually going to be able to make a stronger difference than if you exclude people basically based on their identity. Okay, so I think I made it through without ranting too much. This is the last lecture of the semester. You guys have less than a week to go. Hang in there. I know it hasn't been easy, and that we are kind of all suffering at this point, but you can do it. We're almost at the end. You have one quiz left and your writing assignment, and then you are finished. For those of you who want to keep in touch, please do so, because like I said at the beginning of the class, I know all of your names and faces. I know all the details you told me about your life throughout the semester, and I always love to hear from former students. So, bye.